Good morning, everybody. I hope we're ready to learn. Today, we will continue expanding our knowledge of the First World War and our historical skills by looking at a range of primary source propaganda posters. Now, we'll be using these sources to focus on the aspects of implicit and explicit meaning within information. Now, if you aren't familiar with those terms, that's okay. In this lesson, we will explain each term and you will get to look for these types of meaning within our propaganda posters. So we'll have a look at our learning goals for today. So by the end of the lesson, you will be able to identify and differentiate examples of explicit and implicit meaning, and you'll also be able to interpret implied meaning within historical sources. So that's what we'll be looking at in our examples of the propaganda posters. So this lesson is important as it will allow you to develop some key historical skills that you will need for your final summative assessment, which is the short response exam. So, explicit and implicit. These words may sound similar, but they have very different meanings. So let's start with explicit. If something is explicit, it means that it is clearly stated or stated in detail. When we think of historical sources, especially written texts, most of these sources are explicit because the author of the source is trying to communicate clearly and in detail what they are talking about or what they are trying to convince you of. So if something is explicit, the reader isn't confused or in doubt about what the author is trying to communicate. For example, if we look at an excerpt from Matt Anderson's book, Don't Forget Me Cobber, which provides accounts of the battlefield experience of Australians, we can see this use of explicit meaning and explicit information. So in his excerpt, Matt states that the winter of 1916 was one of the worst on record. Living in these trenches was to cause nearly as many casualties as the fighting. The Anzacs had only 2 blankets each and had to sleep as close as possible to one another just to survive. Water was carried to the soldiers as blocks of ice, and after a few hours' sleep, soldiers would find their eyelids frozen shut. So this source is explicit as it states clearly and in detail the information concerning soldiers' experiences. It doesn't leave you confused or in doubt about what the author is trying to convey. It is clear that they are talking about Gallipoli, the record winter of 1916, and how the conditions impacted Australian soldiers. So we've looked at explicit. Now let's have a look at implicit. So what does it mean if something is implicit? What does implicit meaning mean? Well, it means something is not clearly stated or information is stated indirectly. Sometimes a source may hide its true meaning or at least not make it obvious. This means as historians, we need to be able to read between the lines and interpret what the true meaning of a source or information is. In an everyday example, you could explicitly state that someone's eyes are blue, or you could implicitly state it, or indirectly say it, by saying their eyes are the same colour of the sky. You're not directly saying their eyes are blue, but you're indirectly saying it's blue as it matches the colour of the sky. Now, if we refer back to Anderson's source, it implies that life in the trenches in 1916 was unbearable or horrific. It doesn't use these exact words, but the information within the source reveals that the conditions were horrific. So, let's recap and compare our terms. If something is explicit, it's exact. It doesn't leave room for doubt or confusion. It provides detail and it is clear. If something is implicit, it means it's indirect or it's implied. So the true meaning of the source, we might actually have to uncover it to read between the lines and interpret what's being suggested. So we're going to have a look at how implicit and explicit meaning is found within 2 examples of World War I propaganda posters and how they convey this explicit and implicit meaning. So our first example is a relatively explicit propaganda poster. We can see Albert Jacka dressed in uniform and it's enlist in the Sportsman's 1000. So the text on the slide, we can see what is explicitly shown. So what is the explicit information? And we have our visual and textual information. So we see our Victoria Cross recipient, Albert Jacka, dressed in uniform with rifle, and we see men playing sport in the background. And when we look at the text of this, it's very explicit. It's telling people to join together, train together, embark together, fight together. Now, remember, the purpose of propaganda is to persuade people. So this post is trying to persuade you to enlist and join the war effort. And it's explicitly telling, show the enemy what Australian sporting men can do. So that's all very clear. We can see that. We don't need to interpret that. But if we're looking at what's implied by the poster, what some kind of hidden meaning or what might be suggested, well, the poster is suggesting to us that war is a form of sport or a form of adventure that Australian men can partake in. It doesn't explicitly say war is a sport, but that's what it is implying. And if we look at the underlying message, well, the post is trying to persuade Australian men to enlist in the war, and it's trying to paint the war as this game or this sport that we can partake in. Now that we've looked at an explicit example, we're going to look at a rather implicit example. So this poster here, as we can see, the visual source is very rich, but when we actually look at what's explicit, when it comes to text, we can only see a question mark. So if we look at what we can see, what is explicitly shown? Well, we can see a large beast wearing a pickle horn, hovering over the earth, its bloody arms outstretched, and we can see that the blood is dripping onto the continent of Europe, and its bloody hand is slowly moving towards Australia. So when we're looking at what might be implied by this poster, what the implicit meaning is, we can see that it says, although it's not directly stated, the pickle horn worn by the beast in the poster indicates that the beast is symbolic of Germany. It's a German hat, so the beast is German. Its bloody and outstretched hands suggest that Germany is a dangerous creature which will endanger the world, and this is representative of the war. The blood shown slowly dripping towards Australia implies that the bloodshed of the war is heading our way. And the lone question mark on the poster, it's indirectly asking the audience or the reader, especially Australians, what they will do to stop this threat. So although we don't have any explicit instructions or text like the other one saying join the war, stop the beast, stop the bloodshed, we can see that this poster is clearly trying to suggest to us that Germany is a beast and it's bloodthirsty, and that bloodshed is heading towards Australia. So these have been two examples where we have been able to look at explicit and implicit meaning. I hope this has helped you understand this concept, and we're going to look at this a little bit further in some of our other activities.